Well, first of all, great to be here. My background is, as my mother keeps reminding me, I'm from the Netherlands. I have a Dutch passport. These days, that's quite important. Although my wife is from the UK and my two children have a British passport, so I am in a very conflicted situation. I've been away from my country for the last 20 years, starting in management consulting, starting in the pharmaceutical industry after my MBA in 1999. I started here in the UK with a company called Eli Lilly, and was with them for about 10, 11 years, doing a variety of roles, both here in the UK, where I led the oncology business, and then in Germany, where I led a large part of the business in Germany, and then more regional roles in strategy, Lean Six Sigma transformation. And then I moved over to Pfizer, where I was head of strategy for Europe and Canada. And then more recently, I was country manager and managing director for Greece, Cyprus, and Malta during the austerity years, 12 to 15, which is an interesting experience. I thought I got away from a Brexit, and then I moved into this role as the UK managing director in February 15, and have been in that role since then, and more recently took over the presidency of the ABPI. And before that, I was the chair of the American Pharmaceutical Group for 2 years, and I was also a non-executive director on King's College Trust, so one of the leading trusts in London.
Super. Can think of nobody better to talk to us about the current state of activities. So I'm going to start with your role as president of ABPI. Remember, I had the pleasure of being director general of ABPI for 10 years, and I know you're at the sort of the end point almost of the really big negotiations that you have with government over the PPRS, the pricing of pharmaceuticals and so on. Now, I guess that you're not able to disclose the detail of that. Who would disclose their hand in the negotiation other than the British government? But can you give us a flavour of where we are with the PPRS?
Well, as you say, I think we're in the final, I mean, everybody knows what the timelines are. I think we're in the final stages of discussions with the government on the PPRS. And I have to say that what we're trying to do within that is trying to make that as broad-ranging an agreement as we can. But obviously, there are negotiations, so we never know at the very end where things might be going. But I think one of the important things, what we're trying to do at the ABPI, is to say that actually there is a new wind blowing in the sector and in the industry that wants to approach things in a different way. And you saw that already with the Life Science Industrial Strategy, where I think we are, we're in a much better position, where we've been working collaboratively with Sir John Bell on putting that strategy together. It has everything in there that as an industry we wanted to have in there. We asked specifically for an implementation sort of body, which is there with the implementation board, where we can say, listen, this should not only be a document that lies on the shelf, but actually gets implemented. And I would say that same sort of spirit has continued in the discussions we've had on the PPRS. So, they were collaborative, they were wide-ranging. So hopefully that will conclude in something similarly positive. But I think what it indicates, and that's important for us as an industry, is that it lays the foundations for the way that we need to work with each other in the future. It's more collaborative. It's ideally going towards a situation where we get into a position where we can co-create, rather than give our opinion, something gets concocted behind closed doors, comes back, and we have a 12-month consultation. I mean, that's not the way to get ready for a post-Brexit world. So hopefully it will be more dynamic, more on a basis of trust. And I think, if you look at the Life Science Industrial Strategy and the way that was created and the sector deals that came out of that, and you look at the way that we have been conducting the PPRS discussions, hopefully that bodes well for the future.
I mean, there were some rather scary statistics around it that I read recently, that the idea is that the government and the industry try to project over a few years what the likely increase would be in the drugs bill, and if it goes beyond that, you have to pay it back. And I was just reading from a magazine here, Pharmaceutical Market Europe, that it says that those small companies who are in the statutory scheme currently pay back 7.8%, but the government are proposing that that could go up to as high as 21.7% by 2021. You talk about the life science strategy, that could wreck some of these companies, that kind of rebate. So
yeah, I mean, if you look at, I mean, I have not been privy to the consultation responses that went into the government, but I'm sure that that has been expressed in the consultations to the government and that they're now considering that. And that is even more reason to make sure that we have a good voluntary agreement, you know, that can address that. I do think there are still serious discussions with the government to say, is there actually a relationship between the fact that you want a thriving life science sector with lots of investment ideally coming in to the country, which is represented in the life science industrial strategy, and at the same time you want to also value that innovation, you know, that comes out of it. And I think the connection between the two, you know, I think we had a study that we did, I see Joe in the audience, we had a study that we did with PwC on that as a company, that is a publication where we said there is actually a relationship. The government in the statutory consultation showed very clearly that they believe there isn't one. You know, they put it black on white. And I think what that shows is that I think despite the fact that there is actually quite good evidence, there's also contrary evidence that says that individual companies behave in their own interests. And if there is a whole spectrum of companies in the way that in terms of the way that companies deal with this. So there are some companies that say, for me, there is no relationship whatsoever. And there are some companies that say, for me, there is an absolute link. And if the commercial environment is really bad, that means that, you know, that will also weigh negatively on the sentiment. And I've always said in my discussions with the government that, listen, I mean, what is important is that you watch your brand as a country in this new post-Brexit world, because if you have a positive brand for the life science sector that is one that also values innovation, you're more likely to increase your global market share. Does that mean that if you keep them completely separately and you try from a procurement perspective to get as much out of us as you can on the procurement side, and then you take your chances with individual companies and individual discussions and you pick us off and you say, I'm going to get some deals, is that possible? Yes, but it's a different strategy that you need to pursue as a government. And I think, you know, as an industry, clearly you can see that we still have some way to go to convince the government to go with a more universal approach. And I think that is unfortunate, but it also shows us as an industry, and maybe that's another topic we can discuss, but it shows us as an industry that we really need to show the value of our products to the NHS.
Yeah, I'm going to pick that up shortly. Just to go back though to the points you made about the role of the industry. Yep. My reading is that the industry formerly was discoverer, manufacturer and sells to the prescriber, and that role is changing dramatically. I read AstraZeneca saying that their goal is to realise complete disease management covering prevention, screening, diagnosis, treatment and follow-up. And I think Pfizer's also following this line. We met in Wales recently, and I think aren't you trying to do something different than your traditional role in Pfizer?
Yes, we are. I mean, I think first to say is, listen, I think the margins in our sector, you know, I think this is one of the things that, you know, the journalists are always asking us, right? And I think if you look at our profitability, I think we're in the middle of the pack when you look at other industries. We're not actually as profitable as, you know, people and journalists are making us out to be, right? So that's the first thing to say. But what we haven't done a good enough job of is to actually show the value of that. And I think where we've gone so far is that, you know, we get past the regulatory hurdles, we show the value to NICE in terms of, you know, health economics and cost effectiveness analyses, and then we sort of stop. Yet the NHS and frankly, you know, many countries around the world are now asking us to say, yeah, but show us you can actually deliver value, the value that you say you are going to deliver. So help us extract that value. And I think So what we're trying to do as a company, and I think AstraZeneca is one example of that, is to say, okay, is there a way in which we can use all these sort of adjacent technologies that are now emerging, like data management and digital, etc., to use that in addition to what we're already doing from a product perspective, and either show therefore that the value is really there, which is more closer to home, or that we can completely transform the way that we treat certain diseases, and go beyond that. And that's where I guess some of the concepts are that you're managing. And yes, there are some partnerships, that we have developed that are based in that direction, based on going in that direction. And I think that is probably the future. How fast we will go, it remains to be seen. It probably depends a little bit on how successful we can be in making sure the current business model is still delivering for us, right?
Yeah, and Natalie in her opening remarks talked about the fact that often the payer looks at that opening price and is shocked.
Yeah.
And if you look at the fact that the way that biological medicine is now inevitably going to be much more expensive than small molecules, and CAR T is an example that we've got already, is it going to be that there will be a different way of paying for all this? Will there be phased payments rather than upfront? What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, one of the things that we've been discussing, actually we've been discussing it with NICE, we're discussing it with different parts of the government, is that if you want to, on the one hand, have an innovation-ready NHS, that can actually absorb these technologies and actually benefit from them, and at the same time, you want to make sure that industry continue to produce some of these transformative technologies, you have to find a better way of creating this runway to get them into the health system and get them taken up. Now that will, as you rightly say, depend to a great extent on what type of technology there is, and for some of these technologies, if they are very high priced and they, for example, provide a cure, like for example gene therapy, you will need to come to a very different type of arrangement. You will have to, the price for that, if you have, for example, we have a product in our pipeline for hemophilia gene therapy, that means that you won't need these products anymore for the rest of your lifetime. They're expensive products.
But the politician only sees the next election, and
that's right.
The healthcare payer's got his 3 years.
That's right. So what we need to do is we need to create a system where, almost for categories of treatments, you start to have discussions early on, where you say, okay, for these types of treatments, and I'm just giving an example of a high cost, potentially curative treatment, are you willing, therefore, to come up with a different, reimbursement model? Mm-hmm. Because that may be required there. If you have a model, if you have a disease area like, for example, Alzheimer's, or pain, for example, other areas that are have a big societal, payoff and value, but that value doesn't necessarily get integrated into the evaluation of that medicine. And if you look at the health and social care system, the way that it gets paid for is not from one bucket. How do you deal with those? Well, then you need to have early discussions to say, okay, if those are the types of transformative technologies that are coming forward, and I'm only talking now about medicine, but you can extrapolate that to other technologies beyond medicine, where they haven't even figured out yet how they're going to pay for that. How are we going to solve those problems? And the only way to solve them is to have earlier engagement, to be more open-minded as to what the type of solutions need to be, and just to give an example, for example, for a 1-year payment, that there are some accounting rules around that right now that restrict the NHS from going beyond 1-year payments. Well, if that is not tackled and opened up, you can't. That means you a priori close off a potential solution for the future.
The point that you make about the whole burden being seen on one area, the National Health Service or the National Illness Service, should we say, whereas you've got well-being on one hand and care on the other side in a non-integrated fashion, So there's no accounting goes on across those functions. But suppose then we get to the PPRS and there's still some element of rebate and so on, or there's some way of changing the payment system. My concern is, where does that money go? As I understand it, any rebate that goes back on the drugs bill doesn't go back into the drugs bill. It can go to pay for overseas aid or defence or potholes in the road. There's no hypothecation, is there, in Britain, between the money saved or the rebate taken?
Yeah, no, listen, I mean, we have had discussions about that with the government, but I think there's only so much that we can do on our end in pushing them to solve their own problems, right? I think there's more to say about that. For example, you know, if you wanted to say, for example, I've had these discussions when I was on a trust in the board, you know, do all the trusts in this country, you know, receive the money for the clinical trials that they attract in their trust? And the answer is no. And actually, the gain share, if you want, you know, for what they get, actually differs, you know, from trust to trust. So we haven't even got those incentives, you know, lined up in the right way to make sure that behavior-wise, the right people get rewarded for the right type of behavior. So how can you encourage trusts to behave in the right way and to attract those types of investments? Well, similarly, if you think about uptake, you know, and this is a discussion that we did have, you know, I can tell you, if you know, the reason we want that transparent, you know, those payments, is because we want the incentives to be aligned in the right way. Well, I think, you know, that is really, then you're getting into almost doing the job for the NHS, which is not really possible. But what you can do is talk about the issues that creates. The fact that if locally they don't see that there is a deal at a national level, and they still have a, I don't know, 10-15% growth, and they don't get any of that rebate, that leads to a certain type of behavior, right? How do we address that? And we have had very open discussions about that. And I think, so I think part of this is we cannot create these solutions overnight. I mean, that's one thing I've learned operating in the UK. It takes a while to get to those solutions. But I think the one thing that is really positive is that I think we're in a different position now in terms of our relationship with NHS England than we were even a year ago, where we can have those types of discussions. You know, are they going to be easy? Are they going to give immediate solutions? No. But everything starts with building an open dialogue where you understand each other's viewpoints, and then you say, okay, what could potential solutions look like? And I can tell you that, you know, for these types of areas, how do you align the right behavior so that you get uptake, and in their eyes is then uptake of the right medicines? Indeed. You know, this is really where I think they will probably still, and that won't surprise you, will say, well, yes, but we don't want to have uptake for every single medicine. You know, we want to have it for the ones where we see really. And
yet the drugs bill is such a small percentage of overall spend, isn't it? I mean, it's not the major spend in the NHS, let alone health.
I mean, the thing is, I mean, there's a beautiful graph, and I think the graph goes back too long, because everybody says, well, if you go back to the 40s, yes. I mean, the graph looks very different, but it's an interesting chart because it basically shows, as a percentage of the total healthcare spend, the drug budget basically staying around the 10%. And that is actually expressed as a percentage of GDP, and basically our percentage remains very constant.
Against other nations where it's much higher.
But the percentage of GDP that we spend on healthcare overall is going up exponentially, and as you know, that gets funded mainly in this country by the defense budget that goes down in the same way exponentially. And we're now reaching the point where the two, you know, are stuck. You know, you can't get any more from defence, so you have to get it somewhere else.
Now, I'm sure there will be people who will want to ask you questions directly, and I'm going to come to you in a minute, folks, but let me just get to one other point. We as an industry have been accused over the many decades of neglecting certain diseases in the developing world, of pricing our products in a way that doesn't show any great social responsibility. What's your take on whether the industry actually has that agenda, that feels it does have a social responsibility?
Well, I personally feel that we're shifting in our industry, and this is different company by company, I would say. But I mean, if you look at the issues of corporate social responsibility, they're becoming more important, you know, and I think we would be unwise as an industry not to take that on board. That issues of corporate social responsibility, and they go beyond just picking, you know, medicines for unmet need. It is, as you saw, gender pay gap reporting. It is, you know, what we do for the environment, plastics. There's a whole range of issues. Are we paying on time? You know, is the next topic that I hear the civil service is going to focus on.
There is a whole 90-day delay on invoices.
Yes, exactly. And so there is a whole range of issues, you know, big or small, that I think will go up on the political agenda. Now, when it comes to unmet need, I do think as an industry we are moving in the right direction. I'll give you an example. So antimicrobial resistance. I think I can tell you at the ABPI we have had, and I have personally had discussions with Jim O'Neill on this as well, who led obviously the group that looked into this for the United Nations report. We are discussing alternative ways in which, for example, a reimbursement model could work, because clearly they want to have antibiotics that they keep on the shelf. Well, that's not the way that our business model works, right? That's a societal value. Well, how do you value a societal value and put that into a model that still gives us the returns over time, so that we want to actually invest in those types of medicines? But we're getting pretty close to a potential solution for that with the government. And you know, if we actually put that in place as a pilot, you know, that would actually be the first country in the world that would do that. So in many ways, you know, we're leading the way, you know, in that regard. And all I want to say with that is, I think as an industry we are starting to really look at those things more seriously, and sometimes with a select number of companies come together and say, okay, what would a solution look like, you know, operating in that area. And as an industry association, we prioritize this as well. So this is one of our priorities.
One of my colleagues, I profess at King's College, has said that it's only when boards and investors demand reports on social impact that it will become a priority for companies. So I think there may well be a responsibility of boards to consider in their report back that area. Now, before we continue, are there anybody who wants to raise any points, ask Erik any questions about any things we've discussed or other topics? Can I see any hands going up?
No.
Then we shall continue, but do throw your hand up if you have an idea. You mentioned the patient, and we heard that from Natalie as well. And there's a group out just outside the door here, a patient organisation that we could talk to. When I was at ABPI, with the code of practice, there was a fair restriction on how you could communicate with patients. That was 10 years ago. How do you do this in Pfizer now? How do you incorporate the patient's opinion, voice, and desires into your programs?
Well, personally, I think this is a topic that's bigger than Pfizer, right? We try to, like many companies, focus on putting the patients first in everything that we do. You know, whether it's in clinical trial design, whether it's in whatever we develop for packaging, etc. And I think many companies are now doing that. But what we notice is that there is an increased desire for patients groups to actually engage with the industry and to be engaging in discussions that matter to them. You know, so getting inserted into discussions where the government makes a decision, you know, for example. And one of the things that we've been discussing as a code, you know, as an ABPI, is that the code needs to be adapted in that regard, and we need to go with the times. I mean, if you look at how the code was originally developed, I think it was developed for a certain purpose, to sort of enhance our reputation as an industry and to keep certain practices, you know, in check, so to speak. But I think if you look now at where we are as an industry, with the emergence of all the digital technologies, with the empowerment of the patient to want to speak up and want to have a voice and want to be inserted in decision-making processes, We have to find different ways of evolving the code so that this is really the case, and that is what we're looking at right now. It probably needs to move more towards a principle-based code rather than specific rules. And I think this is obviously not easy to do, but this is where we need to go, because otherwise everybody gets stifled in, a lot of rules that probably don't provide solutions for increased patient engagement or increased digital engagement.
There will be a session tomorrow in this important area, but I've always found it difficult to know who is the representative of the patient. Because if you mentioned pain, I mean, that's a huge spectrum of activity, and what is for one person manageable with fairly straightforward analgesics is not for another. But then, if that's the patient's voice in the room, or is it the patient representatives who are not really the patient, they don't experience all those areas and so on. So isn't this complex?
Well, I personally, I have a strong belief here that it should be really the patient's voice. I mean, sitting on a board of an NHS trust, I can tell you that every board meeting we used to have a patient story. So a patient coming into the board telling their story as to what their experience was with the treatment that they received. And sometimes it was a very positive story, and sometimes it was a really, really bad story. In both cases, you learn so much from just listening to that experience. And I think it's something that we as an industry probably need to do much more of, and not doing it just as a tick box exercise, but actually genuinely listening to patients and bringing them in, not just to showcase them in front of your sales audience, or but to genuinely listen to them, to say what they have to say and what are the problems that they're dealing with. And I think if you look at where we're going with convergence of technologies, with the empowerment of the patient, all the digital channels, if we don't do that and still try and control too much what we do, I think we won't be successful. So we'll need to engage in different ways.
Okay. Anyone want to raise any questions before we close? Right, last question from me then, Erik. You've lived and worked in different countries. You've seen different systems of structure and organisation of healthcare provision. Any messages to the British system from your experience elsewhere?
Well, this is very dangerous, isn't it? Where's the exit? Well, I mean, listen, this is a very personal view. I think I wrote an article with Andrew McConaughey in the Pharmaceutical Marketing Europe that's comparing it to my own country, although I haven't worked there for a while. I personally think that sometimes your strength is also your weakness. And the fact that we built the healthcare system here in a very decentralized way, where clearly you have some fantastic trusts who are doing some fantastic things, but that doesn't get copied, and you have huge variation in performance, is now really becoming an issue for the health system if you want to, first of all, save money, by doing things more efficiently. So there's variation point, trying to get rid of that. And secondly, if you need to transform, your organization, because organizing decentrally, is going to be very difficult. You might have one trust that is operating fantastically well, and you have 9 others that are not getting there. And I think this is probably the fundamental problem that Simon Stevens and others are struggling with, and that's why they're doing it on a regional basis and trying to do it there, but trying to create these integrated health systems. I think the governance part is too much, I think. I mean, having operated on a hospital, we had an executive board, a non-executive board, and you have governance boards sitting around that representing all these patients. You have NHS Improvement sitting there, who are, guess what, also looking in on your performance.
You wouldn't manage a company like that, would you?
No, you wouldn't manage a company like that. And I think and it's too much tilted towards the performance angle. So what I've always said is, you need to allow these boards to focus 60, 70% of their time on performance. Absolutely right, because your you're dealing with patients that it is not the same as what other companies are dealing with, organizations are dealing with. But you need to have 20-30% of your time to really prepare for the future and to strategically change things. And the health system at the moment just doesn't have that capacity. So I think that they need to find some sort of way of finding a happy compromise between, let's call it local and regional competition, with some sort of central element of making sure that the transformation of the whole system can take place, and that somehow they find a way of giving boards and health organizations, locally and regional, a different mandate that allows them to do the strategic part and the transformational part on top of what they're doing right now. Otherwise, it's a vicious circle, and you won't get out of the vicious circle, I'm afraid. That's my view.
And as I see that, as you know, in Wales, with 7 independent health authorities all following somewhat perverse targets of budgets rather than the reality of managing it. But that's another story. Erik, thank you very much for being with us. Really appreciate it, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Watch this.